What up? Hello, it's Miss Caton. You are seeing this little corner of my home. Welcome. Agatha, the cat, who's really adorable but turned all the way up, is around here somewhere. You may hear crazy sounds. It's her, I promise. She's weirded out that I'm in my living room talking to myself instead of talking to her, so we're going with it. I am making you watch this video, which I promise is way more weird for me than it is for you. This is my third time trying it. It's so awkward. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, you are having to watch this video and take notes along with me because I am convinced that we have 3 weeks left together. I know that we have 3 weeks left together before the STAR test, but I am convinced that I am willing to give everything I got to make sure that you grow, right? That you don't stay where you were, that everybody improves. And so that means I improve too. And so one of the things I thought about was when you're doing these stations, it would be helpful to recall some of the things that we've talked about and maybe look at them in a different way. Since I, though currently in my home on spring break, that's how much I love you, am, when you're watching this in the hall with a group of students, you still need to review some things. And so I thought we could do that together. It's gonna be awkward, it's gonna be great. You should be in the resource section of your notebook. So if you're not there, turn there. It's the one where we used to glue things in when I was responsible. Now it just holds all your papers. But if you will go to the first blank page there in your resource section, if you need to pause me at any point, you can replay a section of this. If it didn't make sense, write down questions to ask Miss Spoonmore or me, anybody. But I want this to be helpful for you. Here's what I know. You know, on the whiteboard in our classroom, there is that agenda section, and for the longest time we've had this T-chart of literary and informational. Those are the two types of text that we read, right? All the genres of all the things fall into those two categories. So like on this chart that you're gonna recreate in a minute, we have fiction, expository, and poetry. So fiction and poetry are literary. We know that because literary's purpose is to tell a story, and that's what these do lots of the times. Poetry is a little different, which is why it has its own category. Informational text includes expository. It also includes other genres. So what we've done in class is review what you already know. You know that in literary text, there is fiction, there's drama, there's poetry, there's literary nonfiction, which is like memoirs, which is a story of a memory in someone's life. When we've talked about these things in class, you remember them. It might take you a minute, but you remember hearing about them early in this year or in 6th or 7th grade or even before then. The same thing goes with informational text. There's expository, there's persuasive, there's procedural. We've talked about it. That purpose is not to tell a story, it's to share information. So we've talked about how important it is to know the difference in what we're reading. So you open your STAR test, you look at a page, you've got to know what you're looking at and what you're looking for. So in conversations in class, I felt good. I'm like, okay, good, we're talking about that, so they won't read a persuasive text as if it's fiction. But when it's crunch time, when it's STAR test day, I think sometimes our nerves get the best of us. I know that's been true of me. And so what can we do differently? What can I do better to make sure that you're prepared to show everything that you know? I know if I'm reading a fiction text, I'm gonna look for specific things. If I'm reading expository or persuasive, I'm looking for specific things. And poetry is kind of its own thing. It's why so many of you hate it. I get it, it's fine. So what we're gonna do today is make a chart. We're gonna compare these things. We're gonna write down basically what I know, what you know about each of these 3 things in an effort to replicate that when we're taking a test. There's Agatha, she's so excited. She's not really a great student, but she's cute. So here's the thing. What I'm gonna do is write down everything I know about fiction, and when I write it down, I want you to write it down. If I go too quickly or whatever, feel free to pause and replay. So here's the thing. When I read fiction, I know I'm looking for certain specific things. Well, the thing is, if I understand fiction, if I know what the demands of the text are, I know what fiction requires of me as a reader, what things I need to be really looking for if I want to read it very well, which I know that you do, then I can do those same things. Those same things are true of drama and of literary nonfiction. The same elements that you look for in fiction, I can't move. She's the worst. Anyway, the same things that you look for in fiction, you're gonna find in literary nonfiction and in drama. I would say poetry, but there's some differences there. So, what I want us to practice starting today is that we're gonna practice anytime we read a text, I'm gonna identify what I'm looking at, and then at the top of my page, before I ever start reading or setting a purpose or looking for tough questions or contrasts and contradictions, before I do any of that, I'm gonna write down on the top of the page everything I know about that kind of text. So if it's true of fiction, it's also gonna be true of drama and literary nonfiction. So I'm gonna write that on mine. If you haven't made this chart yet, pause the video, make it. We have fiction, expository, and poetry. So pause me, come back. Hello, welcome back. We're gonna add lit, non, and I know literary nonfiction, that's what lit non stands for. That means memoirs, biographies, autobiographies. On the STAR test, almost every time it's memoir, but we read them all the same way that we read fiction, which is really helpful. It's also gonna include drama. So, expository, though it's its own genre of text, really, it has the same features, it has the same qualities that persuasive and procedural texts do. Now, procedural is like when you were in elementary and you wrote how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you wrote that essay. So that would be like reading that kind of thing. It has never shown up on the 8th grade STAR test. It doesn't mean that it can't, it just hasn't. So most of the time it's expository every year. That's gonna show up a lot. And then there's also persuasive. They are different genres, right? These are not the same genre as this, but if I know how to read fiction, I know how to read these. If I know how to read expository, I know how to read this. Now, poetry gets its own category because it has its own distinct features that set it apart. So even though a poem can tell a story, it doesn't always. It has a different purpose than a regular fiction text might. So here's the deal. When I read fiction, when you read fiction, we know there are certain things that always show up in fiction. So even without my help, if I told you to make a list of everything you know that's true of fiction stories, you could come up with a good list. I'm gonna do that here, and I want you to write it on your page as well. But the idea is that we start doing this every time we read something from here to the end, right? Because it's only gonna help us know exactly what we're looking for. It's gonna help me remember what it is that's important to look out for in fiction, literary nonfiction, and drama. So the first thing that I know all fiction includes is characters. Duh, right? So I'm gonna include that on my chart. So fiction has characters, and I need to pay attention to what's happening to them and how they interact with each other. What do they do? What do they say? Now, speaking of what characters say, fiction has dialogue. And we know that dialogue means what characters say, right? Drama has additionally stage directions, but you know that you're looking for dialogue. You know anything that's not what characters are saying is what they're doing. So that really works for that as well. So we have characters, we have dialogue. I know that fiction has a plot. As a reminder, plot is like story, right? So we know the plot line looks like this, and each of the elements that go with that. So I'm gonna be looking for characters, dialogue, plot. I'm gonna look for, pay attention for the theme, and also for setting. So where and when a story takes place, whether it's a memoir, fiction, or drama, can impact characters, it can impact the conflict, the resolution of the conflict. Your list can look longer than this, right? So when I say plot, you know to look for plot. But if you want to remind yourself what each element of the plot is, I think that's great. That's only going to help you, right? This whole thing is only serving as a reminder to you and to me every time we read something of what we're looking for. So underneath all of this, I'm reminding myself that fiction's purpose is to tell a story. My handwriting is rough. Okay, so here's my fiction list. You should have this list on your paper as well. The idea is that starting today, anytime you read a fiction, drama, or literary nonfiction excerpt or story of any kind, that before you start reading, you're looking at the top of the page and you're writing it down. I'm looking at my page, I survey the text, I see this looks like a story. So at the top, I'm gonna write down what I think it is, and then I'm gonna make a list of all the things I remember about that, right? I'm gonna call that a brain dump. So we're gonna brain dump every time we read any text. So what about expository? What do I know about expository? Well, I know that it includes lots of facts and details, right? So expository text is all about facts and details. It's explaining something to the reader. So I'm learning something new. The best way to learn that is through facts and details about that topic. So it's going to be about a topic, or event. So if I read an expository text about 9/11, it's not a topic necessarily, it's about this event that happened. It's not trying to tell me a whole story, it's giving me information. And that's gonna be the last thing I write. Remember that the purpose of expository is to share information. That's rough too. Let's go with it. Remember, if you need to zoom in or you need to pause or go back and listen to something again, feel free to do that. We are almost done. The last one we're gonna look at is poetry, right? So anytime I read a poem, though it is literary text, just like fiction, drama, literary nonfiction, its purpose is sometimes to tell a story, but it also does something different. Poetry is set up totally different. When you see a poem on a page, you know it, right? You've told me that before. You know a poem when you see one. And so when we see it, what are we looking for? What are the things that are very important to notice, to pay attention to? Because when I get to the questions, or to be able to understand it, I need to make a list similar to these, right? So for poetry, I know I'm looking for stanzas. And a stanza is a paragraph on a poem, right? It's what paragraphs in poems are called. Stanzas are important. You could read a poem and it doesn't have any breaks, any space between the lines, and that means it's got one stanza. Well, the poet did that on purpose, right? Or you could have a bunch of really short stanzas and then a long one. You need to pay attention to the stanzas. The other thing is lines, right? Where we, in a fiction or drama or literary nonfiction, we don't really pay that much attention to each individual line. We're looking at the story overall. Because poetry is so much shorter, especially the kind that you're gonna read or continue to be reading, we have to pay attention to each line. So is one line way longer than the rest? Is one line way shorter? What kind of information is being shared? The other thing I want to look for is figurative language. These are similes, metaphors, personification, hyperbole, all the things that you spent tons of time in 6th grade, like learning all the acronyms for. I think that's great. We're not gonna get into it because you should know that by now. You may not have them all memorized, but even though figurative language absolutely does show up in fiction and genres that are like fiction, it's way more meaningful and should stand out to you when you read poems. That's something you should be on the lookout for always. Okay, So the purpose of poetry is to express. Okay, so this is different than fiction. The purpose of poetry is to express sometimes feelings, sometimes a story. So it's similar in that way, but it doesn't fit within these confines. There's not always characters. There's not always a clear setting, right? There is always going to be a theme. And we know that theme just means lesson or message in a poem or fiction, literary nonfiction, drama. So these are your notes, right? This is what should be on your page right now. I want you to look over it because you're going to do the next part of the assignment now, and you've got, I took about 15 minutes of your time, so you've got plenty of time to do it. Don't waste this opportunity. We only have 3 weeks, and I'm trusting you to do your best work. See you later.